The Metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to be the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross-Friedman, founder and CEO of SuperSocial, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the Metaverse.
Welcome to Into the Metaverse. I'm Yon, and joining me today is Dylan Collins, founder and former CEO of SuperAwesome, which is now an Epic Games company. SuperAwesome's technology is used by hundreds of brands and content owners to safely engage with over 500 million young people from Gen Alpha to Gen Z every month over the internet. Dylan happens to be a really good friend of mine all the way back from my London days. Dylan, so excited to have you on the pod.
Hey, Jan, it's great to be here. Glad we finally get to do this. I'd nearly forgotten what the tagline for SuperAwesome actually was. So it's only been a month or a month and a half or so.
Thank God for LinkedIn. There you go. I got the accurate definition. Just a reminder for everyone, this is totally about information and educating you guys about the metaverse and what's happening in the space. It's not a financial advice. Dylan, first and foremost, before we even talk about metaverse, virtual worlds, you've been working on kids' privacy safety technologies for over a decade, which ultimately led you to be acquired with SuperAwesome by Epic Games. But I want to use this opportunity to kick off and just get your perspective on what has been sort of the core genesis of starting SuperAwesome and what happened over that decade plus period of time of building the company as the internet went from, Club Penguin to 2010 mobile comes in, and then Minecraft, YouTube, changing completely the landscape of the internet for young people. Love to get your kind of bird's eye view on what happened when you started SuperAwesome and where are we now?
Oh, how long have you got? I think it kind of goes back a little bit before that. I've spent sort of my life building companies at the junction of where sort of myself and my fellow co-founders thought the internet or digital in general was going. So when we built Demonware from college, it was at the very, very onset of multiplayer gaming on console. When we built Jolt, it was about the emergence of social gaming. And, as people were sort of migrating from console to mobile and social. And, the SuperAwesome genesis, I suppose, came from a period after that, when it was sort of post-mobile and post-social gaming. And, I had a few investments, somewhat randomly, it has to be said, in the kids space. I was on the board of an animation company, making TV shows for Disney and Nickelodeon. And I had an angel investment in a kids games company. And it around the emergence of, or the release of the first iPhone, you began to sort of see and sort of post the Club Penguin Disney acquisition, you began to see very, very, very clear trends that what was happening in adults was going to happen with kids in terms of the shift across to digital devices. But anytime I went and spoke to VCs and investors about this, no one wanted to talk about it. It was just, kids were too difficult an audience. It was just easy to sort of bucket them into adults. And at the same time, and this was around 2012, we had the emergence of COPPA, Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, which almost everyone watching this show, listening to this podcast, will know what that means. But back in 2012, 2013, maybe a dozen lawyers across the US had heard of this acronym, right? And I think it was to myself and some of the SuperAwesome co-founders at the time, it was clear that we kind of had that sort of reasonably rare opportunity of kind of diverging lines of demand and supply, right? Where you saw more kids clearly going online, clearly spending more time, more digital hours in front of the screen. And at the same time, you had less investment, less investor interest, less sort of general product development interest on this. And, it was fundamentally looking at the gap between those two lines and going, well, this is where the future is. And someone has got to build for here. And I think every single company that I've been involved with building, it always starts with friction and disbelief and general brutality in terms of trying to raise finance and convince people that this is the future. And that was very much how SuperAwesome began. And I think we knew we might be right when we realized how difficult it was at the beginning, on the basis that, okay, well, no one, the math is clearly there are going to be more kids online. The internet was not designed for kids. Somebody's got to fix this. and also nobody else was caring about it. So that I think goes back to the very genesis of like why SuperAwesome was born and sort of where it came from, and we can talk about sort of metaverse and gaming and things like that later. But I think, you know, it was definitely the beginning of sort of like a phase transition, step change in terms of like what did the composition of the audience of the internet look like back then.
So with that in mind, and before we even talk about the future metaverse and how our virtual worlds is going to change everything, let's talk about where we are now. So you talked about when SuperAwesome was born. You've made the statement that I agree with. The internet was not designed for kids. Most people did not care about kids. We started slowly and gradually seeing that internet companies or the big tech companies, a lot of the founders and executives started to have kids, and suddenly they realized probably for themselves, oh, wow, we have never actually built internet for kids because we didn't have kids and we didn't think about them. It always felt like the internet was really designed and was born for anyone above 18, above 20, right? And today that is very different, right? We have almost 6 billion people around the world that have access to smartphones, about 78% of Roblox daily active users, which is primarily kids and youth, access from mobile and smartphones and tablets. We have a whole different internet. What is your prognosis on the state of the internet for kids and youth today, before we even talk about the future?
Well, I mean, TLDR it's better than it was, right? I mean, and I think, you know, and I've sort of written about this in a few different places. Like, you know, coming back to the point I made about like who had ever heard of COPPA in 2012, right? I mean, today I would say that like most product teams working in any sort of consumer environment, you know, will have heard about COPPA. They will have heard about GDPR-K. They will have heard about age-appropriate design code. They will actually be thinking much more about young audiences and how young audiences will access their products, you know, than they certainly would have been a decade ago. I think if you look at like investment levels and measure it in terms of dollars, like, you know, you go back sort of 10 years, you go back 7 or 8 years, and the majority of dollars going into the kids space broadly was into content, right? Whether it was animation or movies or whatever. You know, today, depending on what you're measuring, you've got sort of somewhere between $200 and $400 million, you know, that's being invested into, let's call it kid tech and ed tech, you know, every year. And that's going into different sort of areas and different parts of the problems, you know, that continue to exist. And I think, you know, you've had, you know, over the last few years, I think, you know, if you look at sort of the economic success, you've had a bunch of, you know, fairly high profile exits in the space, you know, Minecraft, Roblox, Epic Reading, SuperAwesome, Story Toys, and like they've all been very important in terms of like, I suppose, highlighting that, you know, kids are a real need and that like there's real value to be built around businesses that are there to support and to service kids. You know, but when you look at sort of the acquirers of those companies as well, you know, they're big, important names. You know, these are not sort of random SPACed companies, right, that are reverse merging into things, you know, just to sort of get a market cap. You know, these are sort of real deals and real dollars that have been happening. So I think it's you know, and I think sort of obviously Moonbug, you know, is the other name that I didn't list there, which was by far the biggest acquisition. Roblox being the biggest by market cap, you know, that we've seen over the last few years. And I think everyone now understands, like, okay, like one, you know, kids are like a recognizable digital citizen, and, you know, the concept of building kid tech for them, building services for them, enabling services for them is a real thing. And secondly, from an investor point of view, which I think again is sort of the critical fuel for the ecosystem, is like, oh, right, you know, there is actual value that can be created here, you know. Like, I think the kid space has suffered historically, certainly on tech and digital, as being, hey, this, you can't really generate venture-like returns here, or you can't really generate any returns here. You know, it's just far too difficult and far too unpredictable. So I think it's like, you know, I could list many areas that still need to be fixed, you know, but certainly there's been huge progress, I think, in the broad kind of kids and young people ecosystem. And I think today it's not, you know, young audiences are not under 13, young audiences are under 16 and arguably under 18, right? In terms of where all these protections get applied, and like, you know, the fact that they are empowered, the fact that they now have their own spending tools, I think we've seen probably somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion invested in kids fintech, like over the last maybe 2.5 years. That's been a huge shift, which frankly I don't think enough has been kind of written on. Like, kids, teens, they're all now empowered to be able to make their own purchases. They no longer have to go and sort of steal their parents' credit card or whatever it is to go and make purchases. And I think that's a huge big thing. So I'm very optimistic about where things are. So I think we're in a pretty good place.
So when we look at platforms like the platforms that over the past decade has really emerged as the dominant environments virtually, and platforms that also shape sort of the next generation of the internet for kids and young people. And these are things that have been happening for the past 10 years. If you look at environments like Minecraft, if you look at Roblox, also if you look at Epic Games related properties like Fortnite Creative, if you look at YouTube, if you look at Snapchat, what's interesting, a lot of those platforms have been around for quite a while. Minecraft was born in 2011, 2012. Roblox really started picking up in 2015, but it was founded in 2007. Fortnite Creative, which is not necessarily for kids and actually have a majority of their user base above 18, was created in 2018. And so when we look at all of these platforms that are being populated by primarily young people under 18 or even under 25, which is still young people, my argument would be that there is a bit of a disconnect between what people see in today behavior and how that shapes what a metaverse could be like, or if the metaverse even arrives, and between what people expect to see today. So let me unpack that for a second, then I have a question for you. What I mean is that a lot of people, I think, at the moment to talk about the metaverse, and just this week, a new article came about from Fast Company that the metaverse is dead. And it's interesting because how many times the metaverse can die in one single year. And I keep saying the metaverse is not dead. It hasn't even been born yet. We're really just scratching the surface of what this massive transformation of the internet from 2D to 3D looks like. And the reality is that quote unquote metaverse already exists for a certain population in the world. Anyone under age 18, 25 already lives and manifests their personality as an avatar in 3D environment. And so my argument is that for a portion of the population around the world, young people primarily, a lot of those metaverse things, virtual world, persistent, avatar identity already exist. But we're failing to recognize that that evolution is going to take time until they become older for virtual worlds and avatar identity to really apply to majority of the world. Just like happened with Facebook. When we started using Facebook in 2005, 18 years ago, majority of the world did not use Facebook. Grown-up did not use Facebook. It was really young people, students, high schoolers, and so on and so forth. Now, my mom, who is 70 plus, is a heavy user of Facebook. That took 10, 12 years, 15 years even maybe until that happened. And so I'm curious about your point of view from the internet's sort of readiness for really these large, persistent, scaled worlds, and we can use Roblox as a reference for that. What are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see in enabling an internet that is going to be quite different from a 2D internet, because we're talking about these immersive environments with a sense of presence where people have all of these different identities, where safety and trust becomes even more challenging? What are some of the challenges you see on how do we make that broadly applicable for a wider age population around the world? And what are some of the opportunities that you're seeing of how brands should be thinking about that?
I think it's a really good point about the need for time to pass for some of these technology trends to really be understood. And I think that young audiences, like either overtly or covertly, have always been hugely important for the adoption of new technology and new platforms, because they've got more time than anyone else, right? And but again, to your point, and to reinforce this, because I think a lot of people declare, as you say, they declare metaverse dead, they declare lots of different technologies dead, and this is usually the moment that value investors see the opportunity and like over the right sort of time frame investing at that sort of at those low points in the hype cycle can actually generate some returns when that same cohort has gotten older. So when you look at what Gen Alpha and Gen Z, so Gen Alpha under 13, Gen Z under 24 is sort of doing today, like projecting forward 10 years, like is a very, very interesting sort of thought experiment. I mean, it's like, you look at sort of esports and everyone is declaring that esports is dead. And the smartest thing that I heard someone else say about that is like, everyone is trying to figure out like where all of the 35-year-old esports fans are. And he said, they're absolutely there right now. You just need to wait 10 years, and I think the same is true in a lot of stuff that we're seeing. And I think, there's been this generational shift, which happens sort of Gen Z levels, or 24 and under, probably 30 and under, like where everyone is now default creator rather than default consumer. Like absolutely everyone is creating content. It might be stories like on Insta, like it might be something on Snap. The percentage of people who are building, let's say, game experiences, whether it's on Roblox or UFN or Fortnite Creative or anywhere, it's still a relatively small percentage. But there's been a shift where everyone now considers themselves a creator. So I don't think like, when you talk about the notion of the metaverse sort of like needing to be fully 3D and fully immersive, like may well be true in the future, like in terms of the devices. But I think that the patterns that we're seeing right now, amongst sort of younger audiences, broadly defined as under 24, is that like people have an extremely high level of comfort with multiple types of presence, across different software platforms, across different physical platforms. As I said, they are sort of default content creator and broadcaster, and I think they are increasingly, and this is particularly the case with sort of Gen Alpha, like they are default traders, right? In terms of thinking about like, trading items, and I think those are some of the things that provide, sort of future liquidities in these ecosystems. And, you have now cohorts, probably arguably 2 full generational cohorts that have grown up, that are growing up thinking like this. And I think that, as much as, when you look at sort of, technology, valuations dropping and sort of the general kind of softness in the market, like all of their behavior, all of their engagement time, the fact that sort of time being spent on all of these gaming platforms is gobbling up social functionality and gobbling up sort of all those behaviors that historically would have been done somewhere else. Like that's going to have very, very, very long-term ramifications in terms of what those generations are doing in 5 or 10 years time, where they're spending their money and how they're spending their money, so I think, there are still some big challenges there. I mean, you talk about, community and safety and toxicity, like, I think one of the other things that was, not true 10 years ago that is true today is that almost everyone has something called a trust and safety team, right? Like that now exists. It is sort of being productized, and I think the notion of community moderation has gone from being kind of this cottage industry to this sort of very professionalized space. I still think one of the biggest challenges for any digital community, whether it's immersive, whether it's non-immersive, is going to be the ongoing sort of philosophical debate between safety and privacy, right? And people sort of describe them in binary terms, whereas in reality it's sort of a gradient. Or it's a slider that you sort of have to shift around and play with. But I do think that, like, when I talk to investors and they sort of talk about, a lot of the big companies today, whether it's Roblox, who's public, or where Microsoft is going, I think a lot of people's views are being very, very blinkered by the standard human bias of like, we see the world through our own eyes, right? But B, just not looking at or not thinking about like, when people sort of, when you see kind of 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds, who still care about NFTs, who are still trying to figure out ways of trading crypto, who are still like, who are driving huge amounts of hours in places like Roblox, like that's not just going to stop, and I think, when you look at, to your point on like how long it's taken platforms like Roblox, like Fortnite Creative, like UEFN, but Roblox in particular, it's taken them 14 or 15 years to get to this point. But, the fact that you have, they are a product of a generation. The fact that you have so many developers there who literally started when they were like 11 or 12 or 13, that is a remarkable lock-in. I mean, if you look around the world of enterprise products, right, or sort of large consumer products, like the notion of that kind of lock-in, that kind of psychological, positive association, it doesn't really exist in many places. And I do think that is sort of a proxy for the level of disruption, that's going to be brought along over the next decade or so. I think it's a very, very, very interesting time.
Yeah, and to echo what you said about Roblox, before I switch gears to another point, in many of the conversation I have with people, and people ask me about Roblox and how does that compares to Fortnite, UEFN, and other platforms, and let alone new platforms that are just being born, I really emphasize that point that people truly underestimate that Roblox spent a decade and a half nurturing a whole new community of developers and creators. And you can't just copy that. You can't copy and paste that, because the level of buying, the level of emotional connection, I like to refer to Roblox community as a tribe, almost like a cult. People are absolutely fanatic about the platform.
Yeah.
And that is something that truly is remarkable and very, very unique and differentiated in the landscape we're operating in.
And I would go further than that, right? Because I think, I spend a bunch of time at the moment sort of looking at all sorts of companies, large, small, new, etc., right? And I haven't looked properly at data on this, but it really appears to be the case that it is much harder now to build a consumer platform at scale, like meaningful scale, than it was definitely 10 years ago. When you look at the companies today, like sort of Roblox and you look at Epic and you look at Minecraft, like part of their advantage is they've just been around for longer, right? And I think if you were a new company coming in and you were saying, hey, we're going to build something to be the size of whatever, Fortnite or Roblox, like that's going to be met with incredulity by almost everyone, because it's so hard, because you've got to figure out how to break through all of that noise, right? You got to do all the things to be successful and be scalable and break through all of that noise. And it's just so many more magnitudes, more content out there that I just, like, again, in 10 years time, if you were to say that, like, hey, the concepts of metaverse like are still probably defined by these three companies, I increasingly, I think I could completely believe that as sort of being the core platform. So it's definitely getting harder to enter this rather than easier as well.
100%. And I think a lot of these platforms also a lot of these new platforms are trying to acquire developers from Roblox, because Roblox became the sort of epic center and focal point for next generation developers and creators. And it's not surprising. Switching gears, let's talk about brands for a few minutes. So obviously, both of our companies, or previously yours, SuperAwesome and Super Social, there's a lot of super here. Both companies, we've been working a lot with brands in different levels of engagement. But I think the topic that I'm curious about your point of view is, historically, when we were looking at internet platforms and brand engagement, it was almost purely brands who their immediate audience are kids and young people. For example, if we're talking about activations inside social platforms 5 to 10 years ago, it would usually almost be kids brands that do kids things or activate and advertise in kids platforms or for kids. What's happening now is interesting. Over the past year and a half, 2 years, we started seeing brands that are not targeting kids or young people under 18 who are coming into these platforms. And even with Super Social, one of our clients is a luxury brand that some people might know. It's called Gucci, right? Gucci doesn't really sell items for 10, 12, 15, even 18-year-olds, right? And other brands that we've served, like NARS Cosmetics and so on and so forth, that are in beauty prestige. And I'm continuing to see that momentum and interest from brands who do not target kids, but they want to be part of those platforms and be relevant as these audiences grow. And the credit I give these brands is that they are playing in the playground where next-gen audiences are. And so I'm very curious about your perspective and what have you seen over the past 2 years, especially being part of a much wider umbrella as Epic Games. What are some of those trends that you think are really interesting about brands coming into these next generation platforms? And what are some of the things that you believe brands, marketers should think about as they look into bringing their brands to nurture relationship with next gen communities?
Oh, I think so many things. Firstly, though, before I dive into this, I probably should say I am not here speaking for SuperAwesome or for Epic Games.
Yes,
or
that is
for
a good
Roblox,
disclaimer.
For that matter. Yeah,
that
right?
is a good disclaimer.
These are personal opinions only. I mean, look, I think the huge challenge has obviously been that sort of, gaming has come along, as I said, and just continues to eat up like all of the addressable entertainment hours for young audiences, for everyone under 24. We have seen enormous enthusiasm from the brand community, both on the brand direct side and on the agency side over the last few years, as everyone sort of recognizes that time displacement, that's going on. And I think there's lots and lots and lots of examples of successes and failures of brands that have, experimented across, some or both of the main platforms here. So I think it's probably true to say that almost every brand, realizes that to reach young people, they have no choice but to get into these games environments. Now, I think to your point around sort of the non-endemic kids brands, meaning sort of, examples like Gucci and electronics companies and furniture companies, whoever it is, like, I think there has been this increased realization, certainly post-COVID, that kids were always influential in terms of household spending. They are now magnitudinally more so. They are also becoming, as I mentioned earlier, like more direct spenders. And I think thirdly, kids have opinions and increasingly have the distribution means to amplify them. And I think more and more brands realize that they cannot they cannot alienate Generation Alpha, they cannot alienate Gen Z from a brand value point of view. And by definition, that means, proactively engaging with them. And I think as they go through that and they start to realize how difficult it is, I think we're now starting to see the second wave of brands coming into these metaverse platforms and sort of learning from a lot of the lessons. And I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of your super social conversations, learning a lot of the lessons or reflecting on a lot of the lessons, from their existing, experiences, whether those are brand integrations or standalone, maps or worlds, or whatever it is. I think there's more and more reflection. And broadly, what I've seen is essentially sort of a general bifurcation of response, which is one, okay, that was interesting. We learned a bunch of stuff. We really need to figure out, as a brand, how to shift this into much more of a long-term strategy that is not based on sort of transient quarterly marketing budgets, and that is somehow linked to revenue, right? And I think, and then I think the second sort of category is brands that are going, no, whoa, that is way too hard. We're just going to give YouTube our money. And and to some degree, over time, I think both of these categories end up figuring it out because they just have no choice. Again, it's where the audience is. I think, when you look at going back to the first category of sort of repeat activators in the brand and agency space, we're seeing, several of the media agencies who have set up arms, to be sort of quite mindful and specific about building out metaverse experiences. You are seeing some of the brands that are sort of doing long-term deals, whether that looks like sort of kind of games, kind of co-publishing deals, or whether they are sort of trying to squeeze this into their P&L to have a permanent presence in, whether it's Roblox or Fortnite or somewhere like that. And I think that the gap remains that at the end of the day, I think neither Dave Baszucki nor Tim Sweeney would describe their respective platforms as being marketing platforms. That is not what they built. They build for the players, and I think this is where the ecosystem comes in. Like every other company that's involved, like whether it's a Super Social or a Super Awesome or a Super League, running out of superlatives, and super base names, but like, and the many others. Sorry, I'm not picking those just because they all had super in the name, but like, that is the extremely important role I think that all of those companies have in facilitating and productizing solutions for all of the gaps that are there. Whether it's management or viewability, whether it's sort of paths to revenue, whether it's amplification, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is a huge space that's got a lot of opportunity in it. I mean, it is. I think it's an ecosystem, really, in the very literal sense of the word, where all of the different stakeholders need the others to be successful in order to survive and thrive. And I'm never worried about this sort of going slightly slower than people expected, because at the end of the day, the necessary function is that young audiences are spending time there, and they absolutely are, right? And that is like, and if you sort of add to the fact that, like, I think over the next few years, all brands who want to reach any audience, but specifically under 24, are going to end up spending more per dollar of revenue to reach audiences, just because of the sheer volume of content. Ultimately, I think this will find a way into the broader sort of metaverse ecosystem. And I think, like when you look at sort of these long-term type deals, and Epic Games and Lego was sort of described as long-term, I think you're going to see more deals like that, where you've got sort of long-term alignment between companies that start to roll out over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But ultimately, and I'll pause here, I think brands need these deals to be predicated on revenue generation. I think that is, simply put, there's a lot underneath that, but that is probably the single biggest requirement or path to, it's the single biggest requirement that's needed for the space from a brand perspective over the next 5 years, I'd say.
Yeah,
do you feel that? Because I mean, you see different perspectives on this too.
100%. And I think what I will build on what you said, and will add that I think what's happening now in this first generation of brands coming into these new platforms, and funnily enough, these are not new platforms. These are platforms that just started to reach scale now. They've been, a lot of them have been around, especially Roblox have been around for a long time. It's funny to think about a company that is 16, 17 years old as an emerging platform, but it is an emerging platform. It just took 15 years for it to emerge, and it needed COVID to accelerate that human behavior and the scale. But I think what I'm seeing, and that's the interesting piece that I'm thinking about, is, yes, I agree with you. And what's happening is that a lot of the brands that are coming in, they're bringing their marketing budgets. It is very uncommon, and historically almost never happened, where marketers have had the opportunity to market and promote products and services, but at the same time generate revenue from those promotions. It's kind of a paradigm shift when you come to think about it. And so I think there's a couple of things that might happen in my mind. One is these marketing organizations will figure out how do they think about long-term strategies of their promotions in a way that also take advantage that in virtual worlds you can generate revenue from in-game monetization, from in-experience monetization more broadly, from virtual goods sales, and so on and so forth. And or some brands will literally start having new type of organizations that are fully focused on the business opportunity of virtual world and the human behavior of that, right? Avatar purchases, direct to avatar, and all of that, all of those things, which I think are really growing in importance and scale, and we'll most likely see a combination of things, right? And so I think that these are the things that I would build on top of what you're saying, because I do think at the bottom line is that we're at a very early stage of this transformation and evolution of a category. I think marketers and brands in general are still trying to figure out what it means and how they will approach it. I think we're still clearly seeing that a lot of the budgets are coming from marketing departments and marketing organizations who are very much, in many cases, still thinking campaign by campaign versus a holistic long-term strategy. And so, I think once we're starting to see brands thinking about virtual worlds in 3D more as a business asset rather than a marketing activation, I think it's going to start bringing us closer to really looking about longevity and how do you really ultimately do something that is really fun, profound, which is finance, promotion, community work, and marketing, and finance those ongoing investments just through revenue you generate from these virtual worlds, which in and of itself is very, very new, I believe, and will enable brands to rethink how they approach, marketing, community, promotion, and so on and so forth.
I think it's like it's probably 7 or 8 years, right, realistically. And I sort of picked that number because, you look at sort of the average age of, certainly on the media agency side, right? Someone who's doing sort of the planning on some of these things, which is sort of 24, 25, 26, and when you look at like the time they start to get to some seniority and kind of more, P&L oversight, it'll probably be their early 30s, right? Because, and the reason I sort of describe this is that, like, again, one of the single biggest issues, right? And this was true 15 years ago when the first wave of in-game ad companies hit the market as well, was that, like, not enough decision makers actually play games. And the friction for that, the friction to understand is still really high. Like, YouTube faced this problem 15 years ago, right? But it's much easier to understand digital video, right? Than it is to sort of spend the time to get into a game, and play it and understand it and actually enjoy it. Like, and even if you're watching videos of it, it's still not quite the same sort of thing. And so I like, to a degree, I kind of, that mental model that I have for esports is not wildly dissimilar, I think, for how I think about this. But I do think the pent up demand is going to, it will be pretty huge. It's already huge today. I mean, like, when you look at the total brand dollars that are trying to get into, let's call it sort of game environments, there's maybe, this is excluding sort of mobile and UA, but I mean, there's maybe $1 billion a year that's spent, in getting into to brands versus, even with sort of linear TV in the US, my recollection is off, but it's about 50 or 60 billion, which is just absolutely, it makes no sense whatsoever, So, at some point, the brand dollars in this market, at least 10x, and that's conservative relative to the audience hours that are being spent there. I think in the US, gaming hours, past TV hours and equaled digital video hours about 2 years ago from memory. So those deltas in where the money is flowing, like, they just don't last forever. So at some point this gets cracked. So long term, I am very, very, very bullish. Like, this is, again, exactly when, TBD, but this is going to happen. This is a definite thing, I think.
What are you most excited about for the next 12 months?
Oh, I'm most excited about not knowing what I'm going to do, Yon. I got to say, it's been like, I've been building companies my whole life, and sort of between things, I try and take a break and sort of the various success rates at that. And I've been quite deliberate in trying to sort of take some time, look around, have lots of conversations, look at things, listen to people, ask a bunch of dumb questions and see what's going on. And it's been very, very cool to sort of actually have the time to go and sort of, see what is happening in and around sort of the broad youth ecosystem, because again, I just think we're seeing sort of the divergence of so many models, sort of, gaming into brands, gaming into music into gaming. Like, there's just so many crossovers that are going on. We are now in an environment where, even though most of this conversation, all this conversation really has been around like very, very big companies, but like, we're now in such a connected place that like extremely interesting niche businesses can exist and can be completely viable. Like, and it's funny, like I'm equally excited by really small, really specialist things or groups or communities or content, as I am about sort of very, very big platforms. And I think that's a very, very sort of, I think that's kind of an underappreciated aspect of where we are now in terms of like sort of being, okay, we're not in the bull market anymore, etc. But like the fact that like that level of investment has allowed for all of these things, large and small, to exist at some level, I think is very, very cool. So it's been very interesting to sort of look at like where the broad metaverse ecosystem is, in contrast to all that. Like, look, I mean, and I wrote a blog post about it last night or yesterday. Like, there's still tons of problems to solve in the kid space. I mean, wow, like we did in SuperAwesome, we did 10 years, and I would like to think we solved a few things, and I think we did. But there's really a lot of interesting stuff left, from like sort of age APIs to like who's going to be the long-term sort of trusted parental digital brand. I think there's tons and tons of cool stuff out there. So I'm just making lots of lists and generally sort of being very, very enthusiastic about the future and trying to remind myself that there are only 24 hours in a day. So whatever I do next, I've got to start filtering some stuff. But it's a very fun time to be having conversations.
Well, and we'll definitely talk about it when you decide what to start next. But in the meantime, Dylan, thanks for being on the pod. I had a great chat. I think there's a lot to unpack from the conversation, and I know that folks are going to find this super useful.
Oh, thanks for having me on. This is one of my favorite shows. I love listening to all of your guests, and also you. Yeah, I look forward to seeing the next one.
To be continued.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the Metaverse.